So hello everyone to the last section of the World of Group Craft, second edition. And for the first talk of our session, we have Lorenzo Ruffoni telling us about special cubulation of strict hyperbolization. So please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the organizers for the opportunity to speak and for organizing this long marathon. And thank for people for sticking around or for waking up, depending on your time zone. So today I'm talking about a joint project with Jean-François Lafont, and that's going to be about these two procedures that you see in my title, from geometric group theory, special cubulation and strict hyperbolization. So I'm gonna start us off with giving you one example of what those two constructions look like, and then I'm gonna give you a rough statement, and then I'm gonna start my talk. So I'm gonna start with a torus, which I'm representing as a square here with opposite sides identified as usual. So I'm thinking of that as our favorite easy combinatorial complex that we understand, and an example of flat geometry. I'm subdividing that into 4 squares just for fun. And then here's my first actual operation on that. I'm poking some genus inside each of the squares. So I start from a surface of genus 1, and I end up with a surface of genus 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, because I'm still maintaining those identifications on the boundary. Okay, so I'm going from something flat, genus 1, to something hyperbolic in some sense, genus 5. And this gamma in the notation will become clearer in a few minutes. So this is an example of strict hyperbolization. So a procedure that moves me from the world of flat geometry into the world of hyperbolic geometry. Next, we're all going to agree that this is not at all the best way of drawing a surface of genus 5. It's actually a pretty ugly way of doing that. So I'm going to redraw my surface of genus 5 in the usual loaf of bread kind of picture. And I claim that that's a better way of doing it because you can now subdivide this surface into pentagons. There's a nice way of subdividing the surface into pentagons. Here are your pentagons, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you will notice that at each vertex, there are four pentagons coming together. So ideally, you would like these pentagons to be right angle, right? Because you have 4 of them around each vertex. That would be very nice. Now, that's something that you cannot do in Euclidean geometry, but you can certainly do that in hyperbolic geometry. So I'm going to zoom in this nice styling of the hyperbolic plane, which is given by right-angled pentagons. Each of these polygons here in this picture is a right-angled regular pentagon in the hyperbolic plane. Okay, so what I'm thinking about doing here is to put inside each of these pentagons the metric that comes from the picture down here. So they all glue together nicely, precisely because I have 4 pentagons coming in at each vertex. And so this is giving me a very nice hyperbolic metric on my surface. The fundamental group of my surface, this pi1 of x gamma, this group over here, acts on the universal cover, preserving this styling by right-angled pentagons. And that's a neat way of realizing that group as a subgroup of the symmetries of this styling by pentagons. That's what people call a right-angled Coxeter group. Coxeter because it's obtained by reflections, and right-angled because all these reflections are in orthogonal geodesics. Okay, so these are very nice groups, very well studied. You can learn a lot of things once you embed your group inside the Coxeter group. For instance, something you can learn here is that the fundamental group of your surface is linear. This is one way to show that fundamental groups of surfaces are linear, which is not something that is available to you from this description of the surface group. Okay, so this second step over here is an example of special cubulation. Okay, so roughly speaking, the theorem we proved with Lafont is doing the same thing, the same 2-step procedure in a broader context. And the context is that of Charney and Davis hyperbolization. This is a sketch of what this procedure looks like. As in my example, it starts with some cubical complex, so something you obtain by gluing together square cubes and so on. And you replace each cube with something with topology. Okay, let me be vague for the moment. So you go from some space that looks like something non-positively curved to some space that looks like something negatively curved. And then we look at the fundamental group of that. And what we do is we construct a certain cubical complex. We prove that thing is cut 0. And we look at the action. We construct an action for the group on that cut 0 cubical complex. So in my previous example, this would be the action of the surface group in a certain sense, giving rise to a Coxeter group. I think many people in the audience have seen some versions of group acting on cat zero cubical complexes. Let me say what we get out of that. We get this condition of being virtually special. That's one of those properties that if you know, you know. Otherwise, I'm not going to give the definition in my talk because I'm not really interested in definition. I'm more interested in what do you get out of that. Why would you care that you have some groups that are special? Well, something you get is, again, this embedding in a right-angled Coxeter group. So again, in my example, this would be realizing the surface group as a group that preserves a tiling by pentagons. And for instance, okay, these are linear groups over the integers. Something you also get out of that is residual finiteness. So this construction gives you a lot of hyperbolic groups that are residually finite. So suggesting that this construction is not likely to give you any counterexample to the famous question by Gromov, whether all hyperbolic groups are residually finite. And I'm putting here in brackets that some of the groups we construct even algebraically fiber, and I will get to that in my last slide. For the moment, let me just say that this condition that you may have seen in other talks today, if you were online, is something that comes from three-manifold topology, and precisely by the theorem that many three manifolds like to look like surface bundles. So they're fundamental groups algebraically fiber, and more generally, you can define this condition for any group, and these groups that we look at have this property. Finally, I would like to point out that via this construction of strict hyperbolization, one can obtain a lot of groups which are hyperbolic, virtually special, and new, meaning groups that were not known to be hyperbolic and virtually special before. And more precisely, I mean like groups that don't arise as lattices in rank 1 Lie groups, or groups that are not obtained by small cancellation. Okay, so this is like to give you a rough idea of the context for what I'm talking about. Next, I'd like to go ahead and give some more background on all the words that appear in my statement. So let me start by what version of non-positive curvature I'm looking at here. So in my first line here, you have the classical surfaces, simply connected surfaces, like sphere, Euclidean plane, and hyperbolic plane. And I'm measuring curvature in the usual way for geometric group theorists by looking at triangles. So like in a sphere, you have fat triangles. In the plane, you have your usual triangles, and triangles in the hyperbolic plane are kind of skinny, thinner than in Euclidean geometry. I'm interested in giving this definition also for cubical complexes. I'm looking at spaces that are not necessarily manifolds. And so in my second line, you see examples of two-dimensional cubical complexes, so square complexes. So again, these are obtained by gluing squares together in certain ways. Whenever I'm gluing squares, in each square, I'm going to put just the standard flat Euclidean matrix. So all these squares you see here, they're just equal to each other, equal to your favorite unit square in R2. And so the entire geometry happens when you glue them together, and you look at what happens in the way they are glued together. So for instance, on the left, we have an example of positive curvature concentrated at this vertex over here. How do you see that? Well, you look at that triangle I draw for you in red. There's an optical illusion here. Your eyes really want to look at that and think it's a nice equilateral triangle with three angles of 60 degrees, but that's not what I have here. This cubical complex is supposed to look like the corner in the top of your room, so there's no three-dimensional volume filling in your triangle here. Here, if you measure the angles, let me zoom in here. If you measure the angles, you want to do that along the two-dimensional faces. So this is 45 degrees over here and 45 degrees over here. So it adds up to 90 degrees. So this is actually a triangle with three right angles, the same thing that you see here in the sphere. So that's an instance of positive curvature, concentrated at that point. Over to the right, I have an opposite phenomenon where I have, here's a triangle I'm looking at, 1, 2, and 3 vertices. Here again, 45 degrees, that's a triangle inside a square, but then my triangle shrinks when I'm trying to join this third vertex over here, and the angle at that third vertex is 0. The triangle is collapsed. So you get a triangle with internal sum of angles 90 degrees, less than Euclidean. That's an instance of negative curvature concentrated at that vertex. And the beautiful thing about cubical complexes is that you can really detect whether you have positive or negative curvature just by looking at links of your lower dimensional sets. Okay. So I'm going to organize this landscape of non-positive curvature into those two clouds. Whatever is in the blue cloud is stuff that behaves like hyperbolic space or maybe more curved. So triangles are very thin, all of them, or maybe just locally on a higher genus surface. On a tree, all triangles are actually tripod, so 0 angles everywhere. So that's something I consider to be negatively curved, cat -1. It does imply Gromov hyperbolicity. So if you prefer that version of non-positive curvature, feel free to replace cat -1 with Gromov hyperbolic in all of my slides. And if I have something that is in the green cloud, well, that's something that has features of negative curvature, but maybe somewhere also behaves like Euclidean stuff. So I want to allow for that. Okay, so that's something called cat 0. And essentially what I want to do in my talk with this strict hyperbolization construction is to move things from cat 0 into cat -1. I want to start with things that are not negatively curved, and I want to make them negatively curved. I should mention that there are other hyperbolization constructions that move you from outside the green bubble inside to inside the green bubble, and I'm not considering them today. Today I'm really focusing on going from the green to the blue bubble. Okay, so here's a roadmap of what I want to do. I'm revisiting the example I started with, where I started with a torus in my first example, and I was thinking of that as some easy input, combinatorial input that we understand, typically something that's locally cat 0. I apply strict hyperbolization to get something negatively curved, but maybe the result of doing that is kind of messy, and I lose track of what my space looks like. And then special cubulation comes in to ensure that the fundamental group of my space has some decent algebra, some decent geometry going on. And I'm going to start talking about this first construction here. What that looks like, what you have to input into that to make it work is what we call a hyperbolizing cell. So this thing that I was gluing in my very first example, let's say I was saying I'm poking genus inside each of the squares. Well, that procedure looks like start with some specific hyperbolic thing that you want to look at, for instance, a genus 1 surface with boundary, and glue that thing all over your complex, which if you want to be a bit more formal, you can represent in a diagram of this type. You start with your cubical complex, and you assume that it comes with some structural map to the unit cube. This is what people call a folding for your complex. So a way of folding the map and putting the map in your pocket. And then you also start with this some hyperbolizing cells, so some hyperbolic manifold with boundary and corners that have some sort of pinching map to push it down to the squares. In this picture here, you should think this is a genus 1 surface with boundary, where the boundary has a certain structure that looks like the boundary of a square, and you're pinching the topology down to just recover that square. If you are in this situation, what you can do is you consider a pullback square or a fiber product, whatever terminology you want, and you get this output over here that we call the hyperbolized complex. And you should really think of this formal picture as being just a formalization of this idea that you are gluing in this cell inside each cell of your cubical complex. That's really what I'm doing. That's definitely the way I'm thinking of that. Okay, so little lie here. I keep saying choose a hyperbolizing cell. Well, that's where the work needs to be done. Like constructing manifolds of negative curvature is not an easy task in higher dimension. So let me give you this theorem by Charney and Davis. They did exactly that in any dimension 2 or higher. They find a suitable group, an arithmetic lattice, so something that acts on hyperbolic space, and that's what they use to construct this hyperbolizing cell. So that's why I keep having this gamma in my notation. There's some background black box choice of an arithmetic lattice in the group of isometries of hyperbolic space. Once you have that, and you look at all the class of all cubical complexes that satisfy some mild condition, like being foldable, so they have this map over here, and they are non-positively curved, so locally cat 0. You can run this idea. You can hook up this fiber product, this pullback diagram that allows you to glue this hyperbolizing cell everywhere. And you should think of all these conditions on the page as being essentially the minimum you need to get what you want. And what you want is this cubical, this cell complex X gamma that is negatively curved. So locally cat -1, and inside each of the cell, it's a hyperbolic manifold. And they come together in a way that does not create positive curvature. One beautiful property about this construction is that links are preserved, which I'm going to sketch over here. If you take a vertex in X, and you see in this case, this is what the link looks like. So that's something you check to see that the initial X is non-positively curved. When you do this operation of gluing things together, you're not changing the way that sets come together. So the link of that point is not changed. And that's good because, for instance, if you input X that is a manifold, that thing remains a manifold after hyperbolization. So that's good because you can input some manifold into this construction and you get a negatively curved manifold out of the construction. And that's actually the motivation for people to study strict hyperbolization. Here I've collected some of my favorite applications of strict hyperbolization for you. There's many more. These are just a few of them. So the first one is saying that negative curvature is pretty much all over the place in the world of manifolds. Namely, if you start with some manifold M, you can find a negatively curved manifold, which is the one that you obtain from hyperbolization, and those two are coordinate to each other. Okay, so you could start with something very positively curved, like a sphere. You could start with a complex projective space, and you get some negatively curved manifold coordinate to that out of the construction. Application 2 and 3 are saying that the negative curvature you get out of this construction can be quite pathological. For instance, the second one is giving you negatively curved manifolds and groups whose boundary at infinity is not a sphere. So it definitely does not look like classical hyperbolic curvature. And the most recent development is this result from Taneda from 2020 that is saying that you can run the entire construction in the Riemannian category. Just to contrast with number 2, the stuff in number 2 is topological, but not smooth. All these examples here are just topological metrics. There's a lot of singularities. In number 3, instead, I can guarantee that those metrics can be chosen to be smooth metrics on smooth manifolds. But still, even if in this case the boundary is Sn, so in this number 3, the boundary is going to be a sphere, still these manifolds can be constructed to be not homomorphic to real hyperbolic or complex hyperbolic or quaternionic hyperbolic and so on. These are new examples of negatively curved manifolds. Our contribution to this body of literature is that these examples can be obtained with virtually special fundamental group. Okay, so with all these nice properties of being linear, inside Coxeter groups, and so on. So while the geometric topology is very wild, the algebraic topology of these manifolds is pretty constrained. The fundamental group is very nice. Okay, how do we get that? How do we get this virtual specialness? Of course, we use special cubulation for that. So just to fix terminology, for me, a cubulation of a group is an action of a group on a cat-zero cubical complex. So some object that looks like that, gluing cubes together in a way that does not generate any positive curvature. I want the action to be interesting, so proper and co-compact. And what is the best thing about an action of this type? Well, to answer the question, one needs to think, what is the main difference between a square and a triangle, for instance? Why is cubical better than simplician? Well, the main difference is not the number of vertices. That is a relevant difference, but not the main one. The main difference is the product structure that cubes have and simplicies don't have. So if I'm inside a square and I sit on side one edge, I can find the point across the room that corresponds to that. And it just makes sense to say walk straight across the room from one point to another, which is something that you couldn't do in a simplicial complex. Once you do that, you can just keep doing that all over the place. And this gives rise to a nice subspace that we call a hyperplane. And these are really the main characters in the theory of cat-zero cubical complexes. They are subspaces that are codimension 1. They separated the complex into 2 pieces, and they're totally geodesic complex. They're straight. So a special cubulation is an action on an object like that that doesn't mess up the hyperplanes too much. So I want these hyperplanes to remain embedded in the quotient. And there are other conditions, but I'm not interested in getting through the definition of special cubulation. That's what a special cubulation looks like, a nice action with a nice quotient on a cat-zero cube complex. Personal favorite application here is to the theory of free manifolds, to the virtual fiber conjecture. So the statement that closed hyperbolic free manifold is a surface over the circle. One of the steps in that theorem that is due to all these people together is showing that the fundamental group of such a manifold has a special cubulation. And the usual way that the thing is done is by looking for things that look like hyperplanes. So things that look like codimension 1 convex things. So let me say what are the spaces that we look at in our construction. Those are spaces that we call mirrors, and they are obtained in the following way. So the input, remember the input for the construction was a cube complex that comes with a folding to the cube. So this map that folds the map, folds your complex down to just a cube. Once you have that, you can take a codimension one face in the cube and pull it back. And this is what it looks like. This is an example of a mirror. If I pull back the blue face, I'm going to get the other mirror M2. Okay. Once you have your mirrors in your cubical complex, that's the input for the hyperbolization construction, you can pull those back to the hyperbolized complex and then all the way up to the universal cover of the hyperbolized complex. So over here, you have a cat-1 space with this collection of subspaces that look like what the picture suggests they look like a spaces that branch out through your complex. And what we proved here is that these spaces are separating a complex. So they're behaving like hyperplanes in a cat-0 cube complex in a very naive sense. The thing we do with them is we use them to cut this universal cover into pieces. And more precisely, we define a dual cube complex to this collection of mirrors. Let me sketch the construction here. I'm going to look at my universal cover, and I'm going to look at point by point. I'm going to look at how many mirrors go through that point. So for instance, if I take any point in this yellow region here, well, how many mirrors go through a point in there? No mirrors. Okay, so I'm going to think of these points as being points of local dimension 2. 2 is the local dimension of the complex, and there's no mirror cutting through. So that's something that looks like 2-dimensional to me. I'm representing the entire region with the black vertex. If I look at points that live on this edge here, but for all these points, there's one mirror going through each of these points. So I think of that as being something 1-dimensional, and I represent that with a vertex of this type. And finally, if I look at this point down here, well, here I have 2 mirrors going through this one and this one. So this looks like something 0-dimensional, 2 minus 2. So here we go. So these are the type of vertices you see in the picture on the right. Of course, in higher dimension, I will have one more vertex for each higher dimension. I'm going to glue in edges every time I have a codimension 1 inclusion. So from dimension 0 to dimension 1, I'm going to stick an edge in here. From dimension 1 to dimension 2, I'm going to stick an edge in there. Let me do one more here. This is also 1-dimensional region. I'm going to have an edge here and an edge there. I am not including an edge between 0 and 2. Just that. So that's going to give me a graph that lives kind of over my universal cover. And every time I see the boundary of a cube, I'm going to glue in that cube. So for instance, here there's a boundary of a square. I'm just going to glue that square in there. And the result is the picture you see on the right. So the red edges are the codimension 1 inclusions, and the gray regions are these squares I'm gluing in. And of course, in this picture, the dimension is stops at 2. Okay, so here's just what I was sketching. Here's the recipe. And the theorem we proved is that under the assumption that you need to define strict hyperbolization and to make your life a little bit easier, we added a few more. But we proved that this complex is cat-0. Meaning all these cubes you're gluing in, they do not generate any positive curvature when you go ahead with this construction. There is an action by deck transformation from this group on the universal cover. And if you think of this dual cubical complex as kind of living over the universal cover, then it's not surprising that this action extends to an action by cubical isometries. That's pretty straightforward. One thing I should mention is that this cubical complex is kind of nasty from a certain point of view. It's not locally finite. All these black points have infinitely many edges coming in. For the same reason, the action is not proper. And again, these black points are the ones that cause trouble. The stabilizers for this point are not finite. But one good thing about this way of running the cubulation is that we can identify those stabilizers that are not finite. So whenever we have one of these points with stabilizer that's not finite, we're able to relate that stabilizer to the action by deck transformations on the universal cover. So something we understand better. And that's enough for us to trigger a criterion by Groves and Manning that implies specialness of the group, even if the action is not proper. Right, in the half minute I have left, I'm going to give you a new application of hyperbolization. So the ones I gave you before were kind of classical. This application we think is new, and it's to the construction of hyperbolic groups that algebraically fiber. Where here the definition of algebraically fiber is that your group G, so this is the group I'm looking at, your group G has a map to Z with finitely generated kernel. And again, this is a condition that comes from three-manifold topology. If you have this condition for a three-manifold group, that's equivalent to saying that the manifold fibers as a surface bundle over the circle. In higher dimension, you don't get this equivalence, but you can regard this condition as a generalization of that three-dimensional picture. So that's what we proved for these groups. And maybe we can just say that the tool we use is this theorem by Kilak that involves L2 Betti numbers. Okay, this is what I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Well, let's thank the speaker. And any questions for the speaker? No? Okay, then I guess let's thank the speaker again.